The dust cloud rising from the land office steps was the first sign that Eleanor Hartwell's careful composure had finally shattered, and when she stumbled into the harsh Arizona sunlight clutching papers that proved her inheritance had been stolen, she had no idea the tall cowboy watching from across the street would become the man who would fight her battle and win her heart. Eleanor pressed her back against the adobe wall of the territorial land office in Prescott, trying to steady her breathing in the October heat of 1883. The papers crumpled in her fist told a story of corruption so brazen it made her head spin. Her father had purchased 400 acres of prime grazing land before his death 6 months ago, paid in full with money he had saved for 30 years working the railroads. The deed clearly stated 400 acres, but the survey map the land office had just provided showed only 220 acres, nearly half her inheritance simply erased by careful lies and falsified documents. She was 23 years old, alone in a territory that devoured the weak, and she had just discovered that the very institution meant to protect property rights had robbed her blind. The clerk inside, a weasel-faced man named Godfrey Stubbins, had smiled with tobacco-stained teeth when she protested, telling her that her father must have been confused, that the original purchase was always for 220 acres, and that a woman alone should be grateful for whatever land she could manage. Eleanor's hands shook with rage rather than fear. She had grown up watching her father measure twice and cut once, checking every figure, every contract, every promise made by men who thought a railroad worker was too simple to understand their schemes. James Hartwell had been many things, but confused was never one of them. She knew with absolute certainty that someone in that office had altered the records and pocketed money meant for land they never intended to deliver. "Miss, are you unwell?" The voice was low and careful, the kind of voice that did not want to startle. Eleanor looked up into a face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, dark eyes watching her with genuine concern. The man was tall and lean, with the sun-darkened skin of someone who spent his life outdoors. He wore dusty work clothes and carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was capable of. "I am well enough," Eleanor said, straightening her spine and lifting her chin. "Thank you for your concern." The cowboy did not move away. He glanced at the papers still clutched in her hand, then at the land office door, then back to her face. "I do not mean to intrude on your business, but I have seen that particular expression before, usually on folks who have just had dealings with Stubbins and his associates." Eleanor felt something crack in her chest, the careful wall she had built to keep herself together in a hostile world. "They cheated me. My father purchased 400 acres before he died, and they have recorded it as 220. They have stolen nearly half my land, and they sit in there smiling about it." The cowboy's jaw tightened. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair and a face perhaps 5 or 6 years older than her own, carved by wind and weather into something strong and honest. "My name is Thomas Garrett. I am a surveyor by trade, though I have spent the last few years working cattle. If you would permit me to examine your documents, I might be able to tell you whether you have grounds to challenge their claims." Eleanor studied him carefully. She had learned caution in the months since her father's death, had learned that kindness often came with strings attached, especially from men who saw a woman alone as an opportunity. But Thomas Garrett's eyes held no calculation, only a quiet anger that mirrored her own. "Why would you help me?" she asked bluntly. "Because Stubbins and his people have been running this scheme for years, and someone needs to stand against them." Thomas's voice was steady. "And because my sister was cheated by the same office 3 years ago, she lost her late husband's land claim and ended up having to sell what remained for pennies just to survive. I did not know enough then to help her. I know enough now." Eleanor made her decision. She handed him the papers, watching as he unfolded them carefully, and began to read with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at. His frown deepened as he studied the deed, then the survey map, then cross-referenced both against the legal description. "This is sloppy work," Thomas said finally. "They have changed the acreage, but they did not alter the boundary description. See here? Your father's deed describes the property as running from the creek bed east to the Red Rock Formation, then south to the Old Mission Road. That is not 220 acres. That is at minimum 350 acres, possibly more depending on the creek's exact path. Eleanor felt hope kindle in her chest like a small flame. Can you prove it? I can survey it properly, Thomas said. I still have my tools and my certification from the Territorial Surveying Office. If your actual acreage matches your deed description, we will have evidence that the land office falsified their records. That is fraud. And even the corrupt judges in this territory cannot ignore clear mathematical proof. How long would it take? Eleanor asked, her mind already racing ahead to logistics, to costs, to the 100 obstacles that stood between her and justice. 3 days to survey it properly, maybe 4. Another day to prepare the official documents. Thomas folded the papers carefully and handed them back to her. I will need access to your land, and I will need you to be present as the property owner to verify boundaries. I can do that. Eleanor took a deep breath. What is your fee for this service? Thomas was quiet for a moment, his hat turning slowly in his hands. If I find that you have been cheated and we succeed in making the land office pay what they owe, you can pay me from those proceeds. If I am wrong or if we fail, you owe me nothing. It was too generous, the kind of offer that made Eleanor's suspicions flare back to life. That is not a reasonable business arrangement, Mr. Garrett. Perhaps not, Thomas agreed, but I am not doing this strictly as business. I am doing this because it is right, and because I have the skills to help. You can accept my offer or not as you see fit, but those are my terms. Eleanor looked into his eyes and saw no deception, only a bone-deep stubbornness that matched her own. She had been raised to be practical, to trust nothing and verify everything, but she also knew when Providence had placed an opportunity in her path. Thomas Garrett might be her only chance to reclaim what was rightfully hers. I accept your terms, she said. When can you start? Tomorrow morning. Where is your property located? 15 miles north along the Creek Valley. There's a small cabin where I have been living since my father passed. Thomas settled his hat back on his head. I will meet you there at first light. Bring your deed and any other papers your father kept regarding the purchase. And Miss Hartwell, do not mention to anyone in the land office that you are having the property resurveyed. If Stubbins discovers what we are doing, he will find ways to interfere. Eleanor nodded, understanding the wisdom of discretion. They arranged the specific details, and then Thomas tipped his hat and walked away toward the livery stable, leaving Eleanor standing in the afternoon sun with something she had not felt since her father's death, hope tempered by the possibility of justice. She spent the remainder of the day purchasing supplies and preparing for Thomas's arrival. Her cabin was small but sturdy, built by her father with careful attention to detail that matched everything else in his life. She had been living there alone since the funeral, learning to manage the small herd of cattle her father had started, learning to shoot straight and ride hard and carry herself with enough confidence that the neighboring ranchers thought twice before trying to take advantage. That evening, she spread her father's papers across the rough wooden table and read through them again by lamplight. The deed was clear and unambiguous. 400 acres purchased for $600, boundaries marked by natural landmarks that her father had walked with the original surveyor. She had a copy of that first survey signed and dated showing the full acreage. It was proof, but the land office had refused to acknowledge it, claiming the original surveyor was no longer certified and his work could not be trusted. Eleanor barely slept that night. She kept imagining Thomas Garrett discovering she was wrong, that her father truly had been confused, that her certainty was just the desperate fantasy of a grieving daughter. But when dawn broke pink and gold over the Arizona hills and she heard the sound of a horse approaching, she pushed those doubts away and went out to meet her surveyor. Thomas arrived with saddlebags full of equipment, measuring chains, compass, transit-level stakes, and notebooks filled with careful handwriting. He had changed into clean work clothes and his face was freshly shaved, showing the strong lines of his jaw and the laugh lines around his eyes that suggested he had not always lived such a serious life. "Miss Hartwell?" he greeted her formally, though his eyes were warm. "Are you ready to begin?" "I have been ready since yesterday, Eleanor replied. She brought out her father's papers and showed Thomas the original survey, watching as he studied it with fierce concentration. "This is excellent," Thomas said. "Your father's surveyor knew his business. These landmarks are clear and the measurements are recorded properly. We will retrace his steps and verify everything." He looked up at her. "This will be hard work. The terrain is rough and we'll be covering miles on foot. Can you manage it?" Eleanor felt a spark of irritation at the question, but she saw only practical concern in his face, not condescension. "I have been managing this land alone for 6 months, Mr. Garrett. I can keep up." Thomas smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his face into something boyish and warm. "I do not doubt it. Let us begin." They worked for 3 days under the October sun, and Eleanor discovered that surveying was far more grueling than she had imagined. Thomas moved across the landscape with methodical precision, taking measurements, recording angles, calculating distances with mathematics that made her head spin. He taught her as they worked, explaining how surveyors use triangulation to map irregular terrain, how to account for elevation changes, how to identify section corners and property monuments. Eleanor carried equipment, held measuring chains taut across gullies and up hillsides, recorded numbers in the notebook when Thomas called them out. Her hands blistered and her legs ached, but she refused to slow down or complain. This was her land, her inheritance, her fight. She would see it through no matter what the cost. On the second day, as they stood on a rise overlooking the creek valley, Thomas pointed out the boundaries of her property with quiet satisfaction. "There is no question about it. From the creek to the Red Rocks is a distance of nearly 3/4 of a mile. South to the Mission Road is another 1.33 miles. The original survey was accurate. You own 396 acres, allowing for the irregular creek boundary." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. They stole almost half. 176 acres they simply took and probably sold to someone else or kept for themselves. "Most likely sold," Thomas said grimly. "At $600 for 400 acres, that is $1.50 per acre. They could turn around and sell those stolen acres for $3 or $4 each to someone who thinks they are buying legitimate land office territory. It is a tidy profit built entirely on fraud." "How do we make them pay?" Eleanor asked. "We finish the survey, we document everything according to territorial standards, and we file it with the Territorial Surveying Office in Phoenix, not the local land office. Then we take both surveys, your deed, and my certification to a lawyer who is not in Stubbins' pocket. It will mean a fight, but you will have mathematics on your side, and mathematics does not lie." On the third day, they completed the survey. Thomas spent hours that evening in Eleanor's cabin, bent over her table with lamplight casting shadows across his focused face, drawing maps and filling out official forms. Eleanor made coffee and watched him work, noting the careful precision of his draftsmanship, the way he checked and rechecked every figure before committing it to the permanent record. "You love this work," she observed quietly. Thomas looked up, startled from his concentration. "I suppose I do. There is something satisfying about measuring the world, about turning confusion into clarity. Mathematics is honest. It cannot be bribed or intimidated. It simply is." "Why did you stop surveying to work cattle?" Thomas set down his pen and rubbed his eyes wearily. "After my sister lost her land, I found it hard to continue. Every survey I completed for the land office felt like I was participating in their corruption, even though I never falsified anything myself. I could not stomach it anymore, so I took work that let me sleep at night." "And now?" Eleanor asked. "Now I am using my skills the way they were meant to be used, to reveal the truth." Thomas met her eyes across the table. "Your father was an honest man cheated by dishonest men. Helping you reclaim what is yours feels like the most important survey I have ever completed." Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition that went deeper than surveyor and client, deeper than two people united by shared purpose. Eleanor felt it in her chest like a physical thing, a pull toward this quiet man who had appeared exactly when she needed him, who asked for nothing and offered everything. She looked away first, flustered by the intensity of her own reaction. "I should let you finish your work." They rode to Phoenix together 4 days later, Thomas's completed survey documents tucked safely in Eleanor's saddlebags. The journey took 2 days of hard riding, camping one night under cold stars with a fire between them and the careful distance of people aware that propriety still mattered, even in the wilderness. But propriety could not stop the conversations that stretched late into the night, could not prevent Eleanor from learning that Thomas had grown up in Texas, the youngest of 4 children, that he had learned surveying from his grandfather who had mapped territories before the Civil War, could not stop her from sharing her own history, growing up in railroad camps, moving from place to place as her father followed work, losing her mother to cholera when she was 12, and learning to be strong because there was no other choice. "You are not what I expected," Thomas said on the second night, his face lit by firelight. "What did you expect? Someone more brittle, perhaps, someone broken by loss and injustice." Thomas poked at the fire with a stick. "But you're not broken at all. You're just angry, and you have every right to be." "I am terrified," Eleanor admitted. "Every day I wake up wondering if this will be the day someone comes to take even the land they admit I own. Every night I wonder if I'm strong enough to hold on to what my father built. But I refuse to let fear make me small. My father did not raise me to surrender." "He raised you well," Thomas said softly. In Phoenix, they found a lawyer named Samuel Morton who had a reputation for honesty and a lack of patience for territorial corruption. Morton was a stout man in his 50s with shrewd eyes and ink-stained fingers. He listened to Eleanor's story, examined both surveys, studied Thomas's credentials, and read every document they placed before him. "This is solid," Morton said finally. "Garrett, your work is meticulous. I could submit this to any surveying office in the country and it would hold up to scrutiny. The land office falsified their records and we can prove it mathematically." "What do we do now?" Eleanor asked. "Now we file a formal complaint with the Territorial Surveying Office and the Territorial Court. We demand that the land office correct their records and compensate you for the acreage they failed to deliver." Morton leaned back in his chair. "I will not mislead you, Miss Hartwell. This will be a fight. Stubbins has friends in the Territorial Administration, but he also has enemies, and fraud against property owners is taken seriously, especially when the evidence is this clear. If we push hard enough, we can win." "How long will it take?" "Months, most likely. Possibly longer." Morton looked at her sympathetically. "Can you hold on to your property while we fight this battle?" "I will find a way," Eleanor said. Morton quoted his fees, which were substantial but not unreasonable. Eleanor agreed to his terms, knowing she would have to use the last of her savings and hoping that victory would come before she ran out of money entirely. They spent 3 more days in Phoenix while Morton filed the necessary papers and set the legal machinery in motion. The Territorial Surveying Office accepted Thomas's survey as legitimate, which was the first hurdle. The second would be convincing a judge that the land office's theft warranted both correction and compensation. On the ride back to Prescott, Thomas was quiet, lost in thought. They stopped for the night at the same campsite they had used on the journey south, but this time the careful distance felt less like propriety and more like a barrier neither of them wanted, but both felt obligated to maintain. Eleanor could not bear it anymore. As they sat by the fire eating beans and hardtack, she said, "You will leave once this is done, will you not? You will go back to cattle work or find another surveying job somewhere else." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. "Is that what you want?" "I am asking what you want," Eleanor said. "I want to stay," Thomas said quietly. "I want to see this through to the end, and I want to know that you are safe and that justice is done. But more than that, Eleanor, I want to stay because these past weeks working beside you have been the best weeks I have had in years. You are fierce and brilliant and stubborn, and I find myself thinking about you every moment I am not talking to you." Eleanor's breath caught. Thomas, I know this is not the right time, Thomas continued, his words tumbling out in a rush now that he had started. I know you are fighting a battle that takes all your energy and attention. I know I have no land and no prospects beyond my surveying tools and whatever work I can find, but I also know that I am half in love with you already, and I wanted you to hear it from me rather than wonder about it. Eleanor set down her tin plate with shaking hands. I thought I was imagining it. I thought it was just my own loneliness making me see things that were not there. It is there, Thomas said. He had not moved, had not reached for her, but his eyes held hers with an intensity that made her heart race. It has been there since the moment you handed me those papers and trusted me to help you. I am not asking for anything from you, Eleanor. I just needed you to know the truth. Eleanor stood up and walked around the fire until she stood directly in front of him. Thomas rose to meet her, and they faced each other in the firelight like two people on the edge of a cliff, knowing that the next step would change everything. I am half in love with you too, Eleanor whispered, and it terrifies me because I cannot afford to lose anyone else. I cannot bear the thought of opening my heart and having it destroyed again. Thomas reached out slowly and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her palm. I cannot promise that loss will never come. We are human and mortal, and we live in a hard world. But I can promise that I will stand beside you for as long as you will have me. I can promise that your battles will be my battles, and that you will never have to face the world alone again. Eleanor closed the distance between them and kissed him, a desperate, hungry thing that tasted like wood smoke and hope. Thomas wrapped his arms around her and held her like she was something precious, and for the first time since her father's death, Eleanor let herself believe that she might not have to carry everything alone. They held each other for a long time beside the fire, not speaking, just breathing together in the cold desert night. When they finally separated, both of them were smiling, shy and awkward and utterly certain. We should be practical, Eleanor said. We should wait until the legal battle is over and see what happens. We should, Thomas agreed. But I do not want to wait, Eleanor continued. I do not want to waste time pretending I do not feel what I feel. Life is too short and too hard to spend it being careful. Thomas cupped her face in his hands. Then we will not wait. We will fight your battle together, and when it is done, we will decide what comes next. Together. They returned to Eleanor's property the next day, and Thomas moved his few belongings into the small barn, maintaining the appearance of propriety while spending every daylight hour working beside Eleanor to keep the ranch running. He proved to be skilled with cattle and horses, and his presence made the work easier and lighter. The neighboring ranchers noticed and speculated, but Thomas and Eleanor ignored the gossip and focused on survival. The legal battle dragged through the winter of 1883 and into the spring of 1884. Morton sent regular updates. Depositions had been taken, evidence had been submitted, the land office had filed counterclaims alleging that Eleanor's father had been drunk when he made the purchase and had misunderstood the terms. Thomas made a special trip to Phoenix to testify about his survey methodology and to swear under oath that his measurements were accurate. The trial finally took place in May of 1884, a full 7 months after Eleanor had first stumbled out of the land office with crumpled papers and a heart full of rage. She and Thomas traveled to Phoenix together and sat in the courtroom while Morton presented their evidence with methodical precision. Stubbins testified, sweating and defensive, claiming clerical errors and misunderstandings, but when Morton placed the two surveys side by side and walked the judge through the mathematics, the truth was undeniable. The judge ruled in Eleanor's favor. The land office was ordered to correct their records to show the full 396 acres and to compensate Eleanor for the missing acreage at the rate of $3 per acre, the current market value. 176 acres at $3 each meant $528, nearly as much as her father had paid for the entire property. Eleanor wept when the verdict was read. Thomas held her hand through the whole proceeding, and when it was done, they walked out of the courthouse into the Phoenix sunshine with proof that justice was possible, even in a corrupt world. Stubbins was dismissed from the land office, and an investigation was launched into how many other property owners had been similarly cheated. Morton told them that Eleanor's case would likely lead to dozens of corrections and refunds, that her willingness to fight had opened the door for others to seek their own justice. "You did not just save your own land," Morton said as they settled his fees. "You may have saved the land of every honest person Stubbins ever cheated." They rode back to Prescott with $528 in banknotes and a corrected deed that showed the truth. The journey took 3 days this time because they were in no hurry, because they stopped to make camp early and sit together watching the sunset over the red rocks, talking about the future in careful, hopeful voices. "I want to marry you," Thomas said on the second night. "I know I should have more to offer. I know I should have land of my own and money in the bank and a house to bring you to, but I have myself and my skills and a heart that is entirely yours. If that is enough, Eleanor, I am asking you to be my wife." Eleanor kissed him until they were both breathless. "It is more than enough. But I have a counter-proposal. Marry me and we will build something together on my land, our land. We will expand the ranch and raise cattle, and maybe you can go back to surveying for people who need honest work done. We will be partners in everything, Thomas. That is what I want." Thomas laughed, a sound of pure joy. "Partners in everything. I accept your terms, Miss Hartwell." "Eleanor," she corrected. "If we are going to be married, you had better start using my given name." They were married in Prescott in June of 1884. A simple ceremony with witnesses pulled from the street, and a preacher who squinted at them suspiciously until Eleanor showed him the marriage license. She wore a dress she had sewn herself from fabric purchased with a small part of her settlement money. Thomas wore his best clothes and boots polished to a shine, and when he slipped a simple gold band on her finger, Eleanor felt like she had won something far more valuable than acreage or money. They spent their wedding night in a hotel in Prescott, a scandalous luxury that made them both giddy. In the morning, they rode home to their ranch and began building the life they had planned in whispered conversations beside campfires and over surveying equipment. Thomas proved to be everything Eleanor had hoped and more. He worked beside her every day, expanding the cabin into a proper house, building fences and corrals, helping her manage the growing cattle herd. Word spread that an honest surveyor was available, and Thomas began taking jobs from ranchers and settlers who needed property lines marked or acreage verified. He always came home to Eleanor, riding in at sunset with dust on his clothes and stories about the land he had measured. Eleanor managed the ranch's finances and the cattle sales, proving to have a head for business that impressed even the gruff cattle buyers who came through Prescott. She and Thomas became known as a formidable team, the kind of people you wanted on your side and never wanted as enemies. Their first child was born in the spring of 1885, a boy they named James after Eleanor's father. Thomas held his son with shaking hands and tears streaming down his face, and Eleanor loved him even more for his unashamed emotion. James was a healthy, loud baby who seemed to inherit his mother's stubbornness and his father's curiosity. They had a daughter 2 years later, a tiny thing with Eleanor's eyes and Thomas's smile. They named her Rose, and she grew into a wild creature who followed her father around the ranch, pestering him with questions about measuring and mathematics. The ranch prospered. They added acreage through careful purchases of neighboring land, always surveyed by Thomas himself, always documented with meticulous precision. By 1890, they owned nearly 800 acres and ran 200 head of cattle. They hired hands to help with the work, and Thomas took on an apprentice surveyor, a young man from Prescott who wanted to learn the trade. Eleanor sometimes thought about that October day in 1883 when she had stood outside the land office with crumpled papers and a heart full of despair. She thought about how close she had come to losing everything, and how one honest man with surveying tools and a stubborn commitment to justice had changed the entire trajectory of her life. Thomas found her one evening standing on the porch watching the sunset paint the red rocks gold and purple. He wrapped his arms around her from behind and rested his chin on her head. "What are you thinking about?" "About how lucky I am," Eleanor said. "About how you appeared exactly when I needed you and saved not just my land, but my entire life." "You would have found a way," Thomas said. You're the strongest person I've ever known." "Perhaps what?" Eleanor conceded. "But I'm grateful I did not have to find a way alone. I am grateful for you every single day." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching their children play in the yard, watching the cattle graze in the distance, watching the land stretch out before them in every direction. This was what victory looked like, Eleanor thought. Not just recovered acreage or legal settlements, but a life built with someone who saw you clearly and loved you anyway. A partnership forged in justice and tempered by shared work and laughter. Their third child was born in 1891, another boy they named Thomas Jr., though they called him Tommy to avoid confusion. He was a placid, happy baby who seemed content to watch the world from his mother's arms, completely unlike his boisterous older brother. The ranch continued to grow and prosper through the 1890s. Thomas's surveying business expanded until he was traveling throughout the territory, always in demand for his precision and honesty. He trained 3 more apprentices over the years, determined to flood the profession with honest surveyors who would make it harder for men like Stubbins to operate. Eleanor became involved in territorial politics, lobbying for stronger property protections, and more oversight of land offices. She testified before the territorial legislature about her experiences and helped push through reforms that made fraud more difficult and property owners' rights more secure. She discovered she had a talent for organizing and persuading, and she used those talents to make the Arizona Territory a more just place. In 1895, Eleanor and Thomas celebrated their 11th wedding anniversary by taking their children on a camping trip to the land where Thomas had completed his survey all those years ago. They walked the boundaries together, Thomas pointing out landmarks and explaining to James and Rose how surveying worked. Tommy, at 4 years old, was more interested in chasing lizards than mathematics, which made his parents laugh. That night, with the children asleep in their tent and a fire crackling between them, Thomas took Eleanor's hand. "Do you remember the night I told you I was half in love with you?" "I remember," Eleanor said. "I thought my heart would beat out of my chest." "I am not half in love with you anymore," Thomas said. "I am completely, entirely, overwhelmingly in love with you. More now than I was then, if such a thing is possible. Every day with you is better than the day before." Eleanor kissed him, tasting wood smoke and coffee and 11 years of partnership. "I love you too. Completely. Entirely. Forever." They held each other beside the fire. 2 people who had started as surveyor and client, become partners in justice, and grown into something deeper and more permanent than either had imagined possible. The land stretched around them in the darkness, every acre measured and documented, every boundary marked and defended. But the most important thing they had built together was not measured in acreage or dollars. It was measured in trust and laughter, in children raised and dreams realized, in a love that had started with crumpled papers and righteous anger and grown into something beautiful and unshakable. Their 4th child arrived in 1897, a surprise late addition to their family. They named her Grace, and she was a tiny, fierce thing who reminded Eleanor of herself at that age. By then, James was 12 and already helping seriously with the ranch work. Rose was 10 and showed every sign of becoming a surveyor herself, much to Thomas's delight. Tommy was 6 and more interested in horses than anything else. The 20th century arrived with celebration and optimism. Arizona was moving toward statehood, and Eleanor and Thomas were part of the conversations about what kind of state they wanted to build. They had become respected voices in their community, known for fairness and integrity. In 1902, nearly 20 years after that first survey, the Territorial Surveying Office honored Thomas with a special commendation for his contributions to honest land management in Arizona. Eleanor sat in the audience with their 4 children and felt pride surge through her chest. This was the man who had helped her when she had nothing to offer in return. This was the partner who had stood beside her through every challenge. This was the love of her life. That evening, back at the ranch that had grown from 396 contested acres into a thriving operation spanning more than 1,000 acres, Eleanor and Thomas sat on their porch and watched the sunset. Their children were scattered around the property, each occupied with their own pursuits. The house they had built together stood solid behind them, filled with love and memory. "We did well," Thomas said quietly. "That day I saw you outside the land office, I had no idea I was meeting the person who would become my entire world." "We did better than well," Eleanor corrected. "We won. Not just against the land office, though that was important. We won at building a life together. We won at partnership and love and creating something that will outlast us." Thomas pulled her close, and Eleanor rested her head on his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him, the solidity of his presence. They had been through so much together. Legal battles and droughts, cattle drives and childbirths, hard winters and blazing summers. Every challenge had made them stronger. Every victory had been sweeter because it was shared. James came walking up from the south pasture as the sun touched the horizon, tall and strong at 17, already a skilled rancher in his own right. Rose followed, her surveying notebook tucked under her arm, chattering about the measurements she had taken that day. Tommy rode in on his favorite horse, grinning at some private joke. Grace toddled out of the house, pursued by the housekeeper, who had given up trying to keep the 5-year-old clean. "This," Eleanor said softly, gesturing at the scene before them, "this is what I was fighting for that day, even though I did not know it yet. Not just the land, but the life it could hold, the family we could build, the love that makes all of it meaningful." Thomas kissed her temple. "I am grateful every day that you trusted me with your battle. Fighting beside you has been the greatest honor of my life." They sat together as darkness fell and the stars came out, surrounded by the evidence of their shared victory. Children growing strong, land stretching in every direction, a love that had started with justice and grown into joy. The land office that had tried to cheat Eleanor Hartwell was long gone, reformed and restructured. But the land remained, properly surveyed and legally held, a testament to one woman's refusal to surrender and one man's commitment to truth. Years continued to pass in contentment and prosperity. By 1910, James had married and built his own house on the eastern section of the ranch. He and his wife gave Eleanor and Thomas their first grandchildren, twin girls who delighted in spending time with their grandmother, listening to her stories about fighting the land office and winning. Rose had indeed become a surveyor, the first licensed female surveyor in the state of Arizona when statehood finally came in 1912. She worked alongside her father, and together they ensured that property rights in northern Arizona were protected by accurate measurements and honest documentation. Tommy had purchased his own ranch with money saved from years of horse trading, settling just 10 miles from his parents' land. Grace, the youngest, had become a teacher in Prescott, but she rode out to the ranch every weekend, unable to stay away from the land she had grown up loving. In 1915, Eleanor and Thomas celebrated their 31st wedding anniversary. They were in their 50s now, their faces lined by sun and time, their bodies marked by decades of hard work. But their love had only deepened, growing richer and more complex with each passing year. Thomas still took surveying jobs occasionally, though he left most of the work to Rose and his other former apprentices. Eleanor still managed the ranch's business affairs, though James handled most of the day-to-day operations. They had earned the right to slow down, to spend their days doing what they loved rather than what was necessary. They often took long rides together across their land, just the two of them, following the boundaries that Thomas had surveyed so long ago. Eleanor never tired of hearing Thomas explain how he had measured each section, how he had verified every landmark, how he had built the mathematical proof that secured her inheritance. "Our inheritance," Thomas always corrected her. "It became ours the day we married." "No," Eleanor would reply, smiling. "It became ours the day you agreed to survey it, the day you chose justice over ease. That was the day we became partners." One afternoon in the spring of 1918, as they sat on their porch watching their grandchildren play in the yard, Eleanor took Thomas's hand. "I need to tell you something." Thomas looked at her with concern. "What is it?" "I am happy," Eleanor said simply. "Completely, entirely happy." I want you to know that. Whatever happens from here, whatever the future brings, I have lived a life beyond anything I dreamed possible that day outside the land office. You gave me that, Thomas. You and your stubbornness and your mathematics and your love. Thomas's eyes were bright with emotion. We gave it to each other, Eleanor. I was drifting before I met you, doing work that did not matter, living a life that did not mean anything. You gave me purpose and partnership and a love that made everything else make sense. I am the lucky one. They kissed, gentle and familiar, a kiss that held 34 years of partnership and passion. Their grandchildren giggled from the yard, and James called out teasingly from the barn, and life continued its beautiful, ordinary rhythm around them. Eleanor and Thomas lived to see Arizona settle firmly into statehood, to see their grandchildren grow and their great-grandchildren born. They lived to see the ranch continue thriving under James's management, to see Rose train the next generation of surveyors, to see Tommy's horses win prizes throughout the state, to see Grace's students flourish. They lived long, happy lives, working together until the very end, never losing the sense of partnership that had started with crumpled papers and righteous anger and mathematical precision. When Thomas passed quietly in his sleep in 1927 at the age of 71, Eleanor held his hand and whispered her gratitude for every day they had shared. She followed him 2 years later, having ensured that the ranch and all its acreage was properly divided among her children and documented with surveys so precise that no one could ever question the boundaries. She died in the house she and Thomas had built, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, secure in the knowledge that the land office had never succeeded in taking what was hers, and that the cowboy who had surveyed it right had given her far more than justice. He had given her love, partnership, and a life measured not in acres but in moments of joy, in battles fought together, in a victory that lasted generations. The land remained properly surveyed and honestly held, a testament to the truth that mathematics does not lie, that justice is possible, and that love built on mutual respect and shared purpose can weather any storm and outlast any obstacle. The ranch still operates today, now in its 5th generation of family ownership, every acre still marked according to Thomas Garrett's original survey of 1883, a monument to the cowboy who measured carefully and loved completely, and the woman who trusted him with both her land and her heart.